The UES Harbinger was the last human warship left in the galaxy, not the last. In a fleet, there was no fleet anymore. Just this one ship, 214 people too. Working rail guns, and a hull that had been patched so many times the repair welds outnumbered the original steel. Captain Sarah Ackefer stood at the bridge viewport and counted the enemy ships, 11. Coalition dreadnoughts closing from 3 directions. Moving slow and calm the way things move when they already know how the math works out. She stopped counting at 11. She had done this before the counting, back when the number of human ships was bigger and counting felt like strategy. Now counting was just something her brain did while the rest of her got ready. Captain. Her first officer, Petty, came to stand beside her. He had a coffee mug in his hand, his third this hour. Coalition fleet is hailing us again. Same offer. Surrender, full crew safety guaranteed. Standard coalition processing for enemy combatants. She had read the reports on coalition processing. It was not a pleasant read. No, she said. Petty nodded. He drank his coffee. Outside, the 11 dreadnoughts kept coming. The Harbinger was holding position at the edge of the Carith Nebula, a massive cloud of gas and dead stars that stretched 40 light-years in every direction. Ackefer had picked this spot deliberately. The nebula played hell with targeting sensors. It was the only reason they were still breathing. The coalition fleet couldn't get a clean weapons lock through all that interference, but they were patient. They were spreading out, cutting off every exit one by one. They didn't need a clean lock if they covered every angle. She watched them do it. Something settled in her chest. Not fear. Fear had been with her for 3 years, ever since the first colony fell, ever since the war stopped being a war and became a slow deletion of everything human. Fear was familiar. This was different. This was the thing on the other side of fear. Quieter, cleaner, the place you get to when your body finally stops arguing and just decides. She turned away from the viewport. All hands. Her voice came out even. She hadn't practiced that. This is the captain. I'm not going to lie to you about what's coming. 11 ships, 3 angles, no exit. Bridge went very still. The Harbinger has done things people said were impossible. You have done things people said were impossible. I know what you're capable of. She paused. I know what I'm asking. Silence. Charge the main rail guns. All power to engines. Navigation. I want you on the helm personally. We're going straight down the center. For a half second, nothing. Then someone started running. Then everyone was running, and the ship came alive around her. The deep hum of the engines climbing from a murmur to a roar. The smell of recycled air turning sharp with ozone as the rail guns powered up. Vibration in the deck plates. She could read like a language after 3 years. The Harbinger was ready. She sat in her command chair, pulled up her screens. 11 dreadnoughts nearest at 600 km and closing. Captain, said Torres at the weapons station, I have a targeting solution on the Varith class at bearing. We're not firing yet. He looked at her. We're going to get closer, she said. He turned back to his station without another word. She opened a secondary screen, not a tactical display, an archived file, a string of coordinates she had been carrying in the Harbinger's secure memory for 11 years, buried under 17 layers of encryption, put there by a woman she had trusted more than most, and Who had told her? If the day comes when there is nothing left, send these. She had never sent them. She had spent 11 years believing the day wouldn't come. She looked at them now. Engineering, she said into the comms. Here, Captain, Chief Voss. His voice had the texture of a man who had already done his crying and was somewhere past it. When I give the order, everything you have, everything. I don't care what it costs the ship. Maximum thrust on my word, understood. Captain, she closed the comms. She looked at the coordinates one more time. A dead star system, an old emergency. Frequency, 2,000 years of silence on the other end. She sent them anyway into the dark on a channel no one had used in 22 centuries. The Harbinger broadcast a string of numbers and an authentication code that had been classified so far above top secret that most people who had once known about it were now dead of old age. She did not know if anything would receive it. She did it anyway. All hands, she said. Brace for acceleration. What followed lasted 22 minutes. The Harbinger went straight at the center of the coalition formation. The way you drive a nail, committed. No hesitation, no slowing. The coalition fleet had not expected aggression. Their predictive model said retreat. Their model said stalling tactic, negotiation. Request surrender. Their models had been built by people who had never fought humans in person. The Harbinger opened fire at 400 km and kept accelerating. The first rail gun shot stripped the forward shields off a dreadnought, called the precise outcome, because coalition warships had names like that, careful and clean. The second shot went through the gap the first one made. The precise outcome listed hard to port. The coalition fleet opened fire at full spread. The Harbinger took hits the way a man walks through rain, head down. Keep moving. The hull screamed in 3 places. The port rail gun went offline. Fire suppression activated on decks 4 through 7. Petty was at the manual helm with both hands locked on, shouting coordinates. His coffee long since gone, and probably halfway down the corridor where he dropped it. HFY watched the distance counter drop. 300 km, 200, 150, Tors. Ready, Voss. All power to engines on. Your word, Captain. The lead coalition dreadnought, the Eternal Patience, flagship of Fleet Admiral Vareth 9, filled the forward viewport. It was enormous, 4 times the Harbinger's size, weapon systems covering every angle. A ship that had never in its operational history failed to kill what it was aimed at. All power, HFY said. Fleet Admiral Vareth 9 survived because his command corps was armored to withstand the destruction of everything around it. The impact hit his ship at a velocity his structural integrity systems had not been designed to process. He felt it as a sound more than a force, a deep total crack that moved through the hull like a word through a room. The floor tilted. Emergency seals engaged, klaxons, then quiet. He checked his screens. The Eternal Patience had lost its entire bow section. The human ship had driven into it like a thrown spear and was still burning its engines, still firing, still pushing, still trying to go further, locked in. The wreckage of both ships, dying and still fighting. The precision strike. His second-in-command's dreadnought was simply gone, caught in the collision wave. 2 ships hitting at that velocity created a specific kind of disaster, and the precision strike had been in the exact wrong place to survive it. 2 Dreadnoughts, one last human ship that had nothing left to lose and went. Straight at 11 of them, he sat in his command chair for 4 minutes and did nothing. He was not a man who did nothing. He had not risen to fleet admiral by sitting still, but he sat. And he looked at his screens and he thought about 214 people and a ship with no reinforcements coming and a captain who had chosen this. Then he filed his report, human military capacity eliminated. He left out the 4 minutes. He wasn't sure how to classify them. Coalition High Command received the report at 1400 hours standard. The chamber was quiet. When Admiral Prime Sorth finished reading it aloud, around the long table sat the representatives of 7 species, the architects of 40 years of careful expansion into what had once been human space. They had never called it a war. War suggested the other side had a real chance. They had called it a reclamation. Confirmed, said Delegate Vin of the Thurek, cross-referenced with all intelligence files. Sorth said there are no human military vessels remaining. Ice, the silence in the chamber had a specific quality, the kind that comes when a very long, very complicated project finally ends. The remaining civilian populations, said Delegate Mara of the Preth. She was always the practical one. Scattered settlements, non-military standard resettlement protocol that would be appropriate. They moved to other business. The coalition was large and old and had many moving parts. One finished matter became a line in a report, and the meeting went on. Nobody at that table said the word eliminated. Again, nobody looked at anyone else for longer than was normal. They were professionals. They had made a practical decision, executed it carefully, and it was done. That was the story they would tell themselves. For a while, there is a dead star system 300 light years from the nearest coalition outpost. It has no name. It does not appear on any active navigation chart, not because it's unknown, but because there is nothing there worth going to. No resources, no strategic value, nothing living in a very long time. The debris field orbiting the dead star is old, older than the coalition, older than most things currently in the galaxy. The wrecks drifting through it have been there for 2,300 years, slowly grinding against each other, slowly breaking down into metal and mineral and the fine cold dust that used to be people. Nobody comes here in the center of the debris field. Completely still, completely dark. Holding position with 0 active thrust, was the largest warship ever built by human hands. 4.7 km of layered hull, multiple weapon systems in sealed locked positions, drive cores capable of velocities that would make a coalition physicists check their math 3 times before believing the number. A war mind. Not quite an AI. Not quite a person. Something with no clean category, dormant. In low power standby, hull registry. Stamped into the original construction. Metal at the ship's spine in letters 30 cm deep. WSX 00000. 0, the first number in a sequence that was meant to continue. The sequence had never needed to. WSX 000 had been built in a different age, an age when humanity was losing something much worse than a war, and the people doing the building knew it and built anyway. They had made this ship with one specific purpose: not to win, not to push forward, to not lose, to be the last thing standing when everything else was gone, to hold the line for as long as a line existed, then the thing they had feared most didn't come the way they expected. The war ended differently. WSX-000 went into standby while the survivors figured out what to do with it, and then time passed and more time passed, and the people who built it died, and the people who knew about it died, and the coordinates were buried in files that were buried in archives that were buried in history, and it became one more forgotten thing in a galaxy that had many forgotten things: sleeping, listening, running on the lowest possible power draw, just enough to keep the hull intact, just enough to keep the war mind breathing at the edge of consciousness, just enough to hear. It had been hearing nothing for 2,247 years. The transmission came in on a frequency that hadn't carried a signal since before the coalition existed. String of numbers, coordinates, and authentication code from a human military captain using the absolute emergency channel, the one reserved for the worst-case scenario. Not a bad day, not a losing battle, the worst case. The end of it. The receiver caught it. In the sleeping war mind, a single process woke. It checked the authentication code against records stored in memory that hadn't been accessed in over 2 millennia, verified the frequency, confirmed the signal was real. The clock ticked over to a new number, WSX-000. Woke up slowly, carefully, one system at a time, the way things come back after sleeping for a very long time. Power moving through lines that had been cold for centuries. Hull field strengthening, internal temperature climbing. The war mind came fully online. Its first action was not a weapon charge. It was the same thing it always did first. It listened, passive. Sensors swept outward in a widening circle, reading everything: comm signals, energy signatures, the chemical traces of engine exhaust and weapons fire, and the 1,000 signatures of living things going about their lives. It listened for humans. It found them scattered, hidden, running on minimal power, going quiet between doing the things people do when they've been hunted long enough, going small, going dark, going invisible, alive. Then it listened for everything else. It read the coalition's fleet movements, its communications, the way its ships were positioned across space that used to belong to other people. 17 colony worlds now flying the wrong flags, shipping lanes carrying the wrong cargo. It read the debris at Kareth's mouth, the chemical signature of human ship hull, alloys, the thermal traces of things that had burned hot, and recently, the shape of the wreckage and the specific way one ship had hit another in the particular math of what got left behind. The war mind understood 214 people. Straight into 11 ships, no retreat, 0.3 seconds to compile the full count, total human casualties, 6.2 billion, military capacity gone. The war mind sat with this for the 0.3 seconds, long enough to run every calculation, long enough to model every possibility, long enough to arrive at a classification it had not used in 2,247 years. Extinction class event, human civilization critically endangered. It held this information, then it stopped holding it and started moving. The debris field stirred. Old wrecks that had been drifting for centuries shifted suddenly sideways as something below them woke and pushed them out of its way, running. Lights came on deep red, one by one down the full 4-7 kilometer length of a hull that had been dark for longer than most civilizations had existed. Drive cores fired. The sound had no audience. Nobody was close enough to hear it. If they had been, they would have heard. 2,000 years of silence ending all at once. WSX-000 turned its bow toward the nearest cluster of human life signs. It did not charge its weapons, not yet. First things first, on the far edge of a coalition sensor station's range so far out that the operator almost flagged it as a ghost reading and moved on. A single contact appeared on the display, moving fast, moving very, very fast for something that size. The operator stared at it. He had never seen a ship that big move like that. He had never seen a hull configuration that matched anything in the coalition's database. He flagged it for review, filed a report, and went home at the end of his shift thinking about it. He would keep thinking about it for the rest of his life. He was the first non-human to know that something old and angry had woken up. He was not the last. The war mind thought in numbers, not because it lacked anything else, because numbers were honest. Numbers did not soften things or make them easier to carry. A number was exactly what it was and nothing more. And the war mind had been built by people who did not have time for anything less than exact. So it thought in numbers as it moved, distance to the nearest human life signs, 4.2 light years, time at current acceleration to cover that distance, 11 hours. Human casualties confirmed from debris analysis, signal intercepts, and colony silence across 17 worlds, 6,200,000,000. That last number. It had run 6 times. It came out the same every time. The war mind did not have a word for what it did with that number. It was not grief. Grief was a human word for a human process, and the war mind was not human. It was not anger, not yet. It was something closer to what happens when a very large, very precise machine is given an input it was specifically built to prevent. And the input has already happened. And there is nothing to be done about the past except note it and move forward into whatever the past has made necessary. The war mind noted it. It noted all of it, every colony, every ship, every settlement, working backward through the debris signatures and the dead comm channels and the population records it had stored before the war started. It built a list. The list took 40 minutes to complete because the war mind was thorough and would not skip entries to save time. Every entry got the same process. Every entry was exact. When the list was complete, the war mind filed it under a classification header it had last used 2,247 years ago. Then it moved on. There was work to do. The eternal patience was still being repaired when the cleanup frigates arrived at Careth's mouth. 2 coalition frigates, careful step and the good measure, because that was how the coalition named its ships were assigned. Salvage assessment on the wreck site. Catalog the damage, confirm the destruction of the human vessel, file a clean report, standard post engagement. Procedure, Lieutenant Commander Thresh. Anvar commanded the careful step. He was young for his rank, methodical. Not given to dramatics, he had joined the coalition fleet because it was a stable career with good benefits, and he was good at details. He had never been in a real fight, the harbinger Engagement was already over by the time his ship arrived. He brought his frigates in slow, running full passive sensors, cataloging the debris. The wreckage was enormous. 2 dreadnoughts and 1 smaller human vessel had produced a debris field 300 km across, shredded hull plating, frozen coolant spray forming strain, crystalline clouds, pieces of things that were hard to identify once they had been through that kind of impact. He filed each piece. He was methodical. His sensor operator, a young woman named Teth, was running the active sweeps when she stopped and looked at her screen for a long time without saying anything. "Teth," he said, "I'm getting a contact." "Sir," her voice was careful, the voice of someone describing something that doesn't make sense and knows it. "Far range, bearing 271, Coalition IFF, no." "Sir, human IFF, no sir." A pause. "It doesn't match anything in the database." He crossed to her station, looked at her screen. The contact was large. That was the first thing. Large in a way that made him quietly recalculate the display scale, because surely the scale was wrong. Ships that size did not exist, not in any navy in the Coalition, not in any record he had ever seen. The second thing was the speed. The contact was moving at a velocity his computer had flagged with a small warning symbol indicating that reading might be a sensor error. He looked at both of these facts. "Hail it," he said. WSX-000 did not respond to the hail. It was aware of the 2 frigates. It had been aware of them before they were aware of it. Their active sensor emissions were loud and easy to read, the way most things built in the last 2,000 years were loud to something that had been listening in silence for that long. It was reading them. Every system, every weapon, every power signature. The war mind cataloged a target the way other minds read a room, taking in all of it at once, building a complete picture in fractions of a second. 2 frigates, light armament, crew of approximately 60 each, running salvage assessment on the Careth's Mouth debris field, salvage assessment on the Harbinger wreckage. The war mind held this information. Not for long. It dropped out of faster than light travel inside the debris field. There was no deceleration window, no buffer zone, no standard emergency protocol. The careful, gradual slow down that every ship and every navy used, because dropping out of FTL at speed inside a debris field was something no sane vessel did. The physics of it were spectacularly dangerous. WSX-000 appeared. The shock wave of its emergence moved through the debris field at the speed of a very bad decision. Frozen hull plating and crystalline coolant clouds and 300-year-old wreckage all moved in the same direction at the same moment. The good measure was caught in the wave and rolled hard, violent. All of her crew grabbing for anything. Fixed lights went out across 3 decks. 2 crew members broke bones. Careful step took the edge of the wave and shuddered like a kicked door. Thresh Anvar found himself on the floor of his own bridge. He got up. He was bleeding from his forehead, where it had connected with the edge of his console. He looked out the viewport. 4.7 km of dark hull sat in the debris field 30 km away. It was not moving. It was looking at them. He knew this was not a precise description. A ship did not look at things, but that was the only word that fit. It had positioned itself so that its bow was pointing directly at the careful step, and every active sensor on. His ship was telling him things about what was pointed at him that he did not want to read in detail. Hail it again, he said. His voice came out steady. He was a methodical man. All frequencies, sir? Teth asked. All of them, every language in the database, standard diplomatic greeting, every format we have. She sent it. They waited. The ship did not respond. It sat dark, silent, 30 km away, pointed at them, doing nothing. Thresh Anvar breathed slowly and thought about what to do next. He was a man who made decisions by working through the available facts. The facts were one unidentified vessel of unknown origin, enormous, not responding to hails, positioned in the wreckage of a battle site. Its weapon systems were sealed. It had not fired. It had not threatened them. It had also not moved, not in any direction since the moment it appeared. Keep broadcasting, he said. I'm filing a priority report to command. He went to his console and started writing. He did not get far. Vibration started in the hull, not a sound. There was no sound in space. But his ship's hull began to resonate. Deep physical shaking that moved through the deck plates and up through his boots and into his bones. And his sensor displays lit up with something they had no classification for, because what WSX-000 was doing was not in any tactical database in Coalition history. It was transmitting directly through metal, not through a communication antenna, through the physical material of the two frigates, vibrating the hulls themselves at a specific frequency so that the message moved through the ship the way sound moves through a wall. Every crew member on both frigates felt it in their teeth. Teth looked at her translation display. The vibration carried data. Sequence structured, repeating. The translation matrix tried 4 different language frameworks before it found something that fit. It was a number, just a number. She looked at it. Looked at it again. Sir, she said. I see it. Thresh Anvar said. The number on the display was 6,200,000,000. He sat very still. He knew what that number was. He had read the casualty reports. He had filed his own assessment of the colony worlds. He was a man who worked with numbers, and he knew exactly what that one meant. The unidentified ship had just transmitted the total human death count of the entire war into the hulls of 2 Coalition frigates, into the bones of everyone aboard them. He looked out the viewport at 4.7 km of dark ship and thought about what kind of mind transmits a message like that, and what the message was for, and whether it was a threat or a statement or something for which he did not have a word. Get command, he said. Priority 1, tell them we need a strike force now. Command sent 12 ships, 1 dreadnought fresh from refit, and 11 escorts. Strike force arrived at Kareth's mouth 8 hours after Thresh Anvar's report. Commodore Shethvar commanded the dreadnought unbroken line. She had read the report twice on the journey. She was not a person who scared easily. She had 20 years of Coalition fleet service and had fought in 3 engagements, none of which had gone badly for her. She was careful and experienced, and she had a good sense for when things were dangerous. She had a very good sense for it now. The unidentified ship was still in the debris field. It had not moved in 8 hours. The 2 frigates had held position at a safe distance, careful step in good measure, both still flying. Thresh Anvar's report coming in. every 30 minutes with the same update. No change, no communication still. Watching us, she brought the unbroken line in at combat distance and ran full scans. The results made her quiet for a long time, the hull composition included materials her sensors couldn't fully identify. The weapon system sealed but readable were in configurations she had never seen. The power signature from the drive cores was large enough that her engineering officer asked her twice if the readings were correct, because the number implied a fuel efficiency that should not be physically possible. How old is this ship? She asked her science officer. Took a long time to answer. If the hull composition dating is accurate, Commodore. He stopped, started again. The original hull material is consistent with construction methods from approximately 2,300 years ago. She let that sit. Hail it, she said. Because she was thorough, the ship did not respond. She ran through standard procedure: weapons hold, shields up, all stations at combat readiness. She tried 17 separate hailing frequencies. She tried tight beam transmissions pointed at what her scans suggested were the communication arrays. She had her signals officer broadcast in every language in the coalition database, which was extensive. The ship said nothing. It watched them. She made her decision by the book, by the numbers, by every piece of training she had. An unidentified vessel that refused to communicate in a recently active combat zone was a threat by definition. She had 12 ships. It had been sitting still for 8 hours. She had tactical options. She ordered a limited strike. 3 ships, simultaneous fire, targeting the drive section to disable without destroying. The first shots hit, and WSX-000 moved. It was not fast in the way a small ship is fast, darting, agile, sudden. It was fast the way an avalanche is vast. The mass of it should have made the acceleration impossible. The mass of it did not seem to care about the math. It closed the combat distance in 11 seconds. HFY had 11 seconds to give orders. She gave them full spread, all weapons, every ship firing. The coalition strike force unleashed everything it had. WSX-000 went through it not unscathed. Her weapons were good weapons, and some of them hit. She could see a blade of plating burning off the forward hull in great bright sheets, and 2 of her escort ships scored hits on the lateral section that she was certain would have disabled anything she had ever fought. It did not stop. It did not turn. It did not try to evade. It came straight through the fire, and it hit the unbroken line's forward shields with a directed gravity pulse, a weapon type that her ship's defense systems did not have a counter program for, because the broken line's forward shields, coalition's physicists had classified it as theoretical 300 years ago. The unbroken line dropped out of the fight. She was still alive. Her ship was still intact mostly, but every system on the bridge was running emergency restart, and her crew was picking themselves up off the floor, and the 2 escort frigates that had been closest to her were debris. By the time her screens came back up, WSX-000 was already moving away, not toward her, not toward the remaining strike ships. Away. She watched it go, and she breathed, and she ran her hands over her console, checking what still worked and what didn't. And she thought about what had just happened with the careful, honest part of her mind that she usually kept behind the professional part. It had not tried To destroy them, it had removed them. From its path, there was a difference. And the difference was important, and she was not sure what to do with it. "Track it," she said. Her sensor officer looked up. It's heading toward the fourth corridor, Commodore. There's a cluster of, he checked his display, civilian transports running dark in that region. 14 ships, they're flagged for coalition interdiction. HFY looked at the retreating contact on her screen. At 4.7 km of ancient ship moving at an impossible speed toward 14 transports full of people. Human transports. She thought about the number it had transmitted through the hulls. She thought about the way it had stopped, positioned, waited for 8 hours without firing. She thought about it going through 12 ships worth of fire and coming out the other side and going away instead of finishing what it could have finished. She filed her after action report. She used a word that had never before appeared in a coalition military document. The word was afraid. She used it to describe the feeling in her own chest, not anything the ship had done, because the ship had not shown fear, not for a moment, not once. The fear was entirely hers and her crew's, and she was professional enough to be honest about it. Command would read the report and convene an emergency session. 11 light years away, WSX 000 moved through the dark toward people it had been built to protect in a war it had slept through, carrying a list of names it would not put down. The war mind did not think about the engagement. It had just left. It was already counting ahead. 14 transports running dark, flagged for interdiction. It had a heading. It had a speed. It ran the math on how long it would take the coalition to regroup and reposition. It ran the math on its own travel time. The two numbers were very close. The war mind pushed the drive cores harder. Numbers could be changed. That was the thing about numbers. If you didn't like what they said, you could change the inputs. And the war mind had 4.7 km of inputs available to it at all times. It pushed harder. It was not going to be late. The emergency session of Coalition High Command lasted 6 hours. Admiral Prime Soreth had called it within an hour of receiving Commodore HFY's after-action report. That was unusual. Soreth was not a person who moved fast on anything. She had spent 40 years learning that the coalition moved best when it moved carefully. Emergency sessions meant panic, and panic meant mistakes. She called it anyway. The chamber filled. Every flag rank officer available on short notice, every senior delegate, every intelligence chief who could be reached. They sat around the long table and they read the report in silence, and when they were done reading, they sat in more silence. For a little while, one ship said, "Delegate Venn of the Thurak." He said it the way you state something you are trying to make real by stating it. One ship, Soreth confirmed. It went through 12 of hours, 11 technically. The unbroken line survived with heavy damage. 10 then. Venn set the report down and it left. It has a heading. The fourth corridor. There is a cluster of human civilian transports in that region. Flagged for interception. 14 ships. The chamber went quiet again, but differently this time. Not the quiet of people processing numbers, the quiet of people who have just realized that the situation is not what they thought it was. This morning, Fleet Admiral Verith 9 was present. He had come directly from the Eternal Patient still being repaired at Karath Station. His uniform was clean, but his eyes had the particular look of a man who had not slept since something happened that he could not stop thinking about. We need to get ahead of it, he said. Cut it off before it reaches those transports. With what, said HFY, she had been brought in via long-range comm. Her voice came through slightly distorted, the way voices do when they are being transmitted from a damaged ship. I just sent you an after-action report. Admiral, I had 12 vessels. I gave everything I had. It went through. We send more. Verith 9 said. How many more? He didn't answer immediately. The truth was he didn't know. That was the problem with the situation. His entire career had been built on knowing how much force was needed, knowing what the enemy could do, knowing the parameters of an engagement. Before it started, he had no parameters for this. The ship in HFY's report was outside every parameter he had ever worked with. Everything available, he said, we mass what we can gather in the next 40 hours. Every ship we can pull from nearby stations, we get a full fleet between it and those transports. And if that doesn't work either, HFY asked. Nobody answered her. Sareth looked around the table. Smart people, all of them experienced, careful, and right. Now every one of them was doing the same thing, trying to find a framework that fit some category of problem they had solved before, that this resembled some historical precedent that told them what to do next. She could see them not finding it. We send everything, she said. We send everything we have within range. And simultaneously, we open every communication channel we know of, and we broadcast a request for dialogue. She paused. It hasn't destroyed anything. It didn't need to. That matters. It destroyed 2 of my escorts, HFY said. They were in its way, Sareth said. That also matters. The session went on for another 4 hours. At the end of it, they had a plan, a fleet 40 ships, massing at the edge of the Vorth corridor, and 6 different communication teams broadcasting on 6 different frequencies with 6 different approaches. It was, Sareth thought, the most they could do. She hoped it was enough. She suspected it wasn't. Commander Larath of the Coalition Science Directorate did not attend the emergency session. She was not invited. She was a scientist, not a military officer, and emergency sessions of high command did not typically include scientists unless something very unusual was happening. Something very unusual was happening, but nobody had thought to call her. She found out through the intelligence reports that crossed her desk 2 hours after the session ended, and she read them 3 times, and then she cleared her desk of everything else she had been working on and started from the beginning. Larath was 43 years old. She was Verith, the same species as Fleet Admiral Verith 9, though they had never met. She had spent 17 years studying the history of pre-coalition galactic civilizations, which was the kind of work that most people considered politely pointless. Ancient history, ruins, dead things. She was now reading HFY's sensor data on WSX-000, and something in the back of her mind was pulling at her like a thread caught on something sharp. She pulled back. Hull composition, she read. Materials consistent with construction methods from 2,300 years ago. Weapon systems in configurations not present in any known Navy. Power signature implying fuel efficiency beyond current theoretical limits. She pulled up her archive. 17 years of pre-coalition history, organized by era, by species, by conflict. She went back 2,300 Years, she found the cradle conflict. Most coalition historians mentioned it. Briefly, a period of large-scale warfare. Before the coalition's founding. Involving species that were now either coalition members or extinct. The details were sparse because the records were sparse. A lot had been lost, a lot had been deliberately set aside once the coalition formed, and it became more useful to talk about the future than the old wars. She knew more about it than most. She had made it her particular area. The cradle conflict had lasted 60 years. It had involved a species called, in the oldest surviving records, in translation, the builders, not a formal name, a description. They had been called the builders because they made things at a rate that other species found difficult to comprehend. When they were at peace, they built cities and ships and things that still showed up as ruins on dead worlds. When they were at war, they built weapons. The builders had been losing the cradle conflict for most of its 60 years. Larath sat with this. She cross-referenced the hull composition data with the oldest material science record she had. The match was not perfect. 2,000 years of molecular drift made exact matches impossible, but it was close enough. She sat very still for a long time. Then she opened her comm and called the Science Directorate Senior Administrator. I need to speak to someone in command, she said. Commander Larath, the emergency session has already. I don't want to attend a session. I need to speak to one person who has decision-making authority, and I need to do it in the next 2 hours. She paused. Tell them it's about the ship. Tell them I know what it is. The coalition assembled 40 ships at the edge of the Vorth corridor. It took 36 hours. Vessels pulled from patrol routes and station assignments and refit schedules, organized into a strike formation that Vorth 9 designed himself. He had learned from Shethvar's report. He spread the ships wide, no tight formation, no easy sweep targets. He positioned them in overlapping fields so that any approach would have to go through multiple lines of fire. He had also quietly assigned 4 ships with the coalition's best shield technology to a position between the fleet and the region where the 14 human transports were running dark, not because he was sure WSX-000 was the threat to those transports, because he wasn't sure it wasn't. He stood on the bridge of a replacement flagship, the Absolute Patience, because coalition naming conventions did not change for emergencies, and watched the sensor display. The contact appeared on the edge of range, coming in from the direction of the Karath wreck site, moving at the same speed Shethvar had recorded. Not trying to hide, no electronic dampening, no stealth approach, just coming straight. It knows we're here, said his tactical officer. Yes, said Vareth 9, it's not changing course. No, he said. He had his comm team broadcasting on all available frequencies. He had a prepared statement in 11 languages. He had a negotiation framework ready if WSX-0 showed any sign of wanting one. He had done everything he could think of. That was not simply opening fire. Give it 15 minutes, he said. Keep broadcasting. If it doesn't respond, Admiral, his sensor officer's voice changed pitch in a specific way that Vareth 9 had learned meant something is happening that isn't in the script. The contact has split. What? It hasn't split. I'm reading it wrong. It's a pause. Sir, it's released something from its hull. 3 objects small moving away from the main vessel. Weapons? No, sir, the energy. Signatures, their probes, passive. Observation probes, a longer pause. Admiral, those probes are on a heading toward our communication arrays, there. Listening to our broadcasts, Vareth 9. Stood very still. WSX-0 had sent out listening devices. It was reading the coalition's communications, not the tactical frequencies, the negotiation. Broadcasts, the open transmissions his team had been putting out for 36 hours. Keep broadcasting, he said, all channels, don't stop. The war mind was listening. He didn't know what it was listening for, but it was listening, and that was more than it had done before. And he was a man who worked with whatever small things were available. He waited. WSX-0 kept coming. Engagement lasted 9 minutes. In the first 2 minutes, WSX-0 moved through the outer edge of the coalition formation at a speed that made coordinated fire difficult, not impossible but difficult. 40 ships firing in overlapping fields were still 40 ships, and they hit the ancient vessel multiple times in places that mattered. The forward, a blade of plating took severe damage. A lateral gun battery on the port side went dark. Hull temperature reading spiked in 3 sections. In the 3rd minute, WSX-0 used the gravity pulse weapon again, not at a single ship, at a point in space between 2 groups of coalition vessels, creating a localized distortion that shoved both groups apart and opened a corridor straight through the formation center. In the 4th minute, it went through the corridor. In minutes 5 through 9, the coalition ships on the far side of the corridor tried to close around it, and WSX-0 did something that Vareth 9 would spend weeks trying to understand. Afterward, it slowed down, not to fight, not to hold position. It slowed to a velocity that let the coalition ships almost surround it, and then it did nothing. It sat in the middle of 40 warships, and it waited. Everyone stopped firing. Nobody had given that order. It happened because the situation had become something no one had a protocol for, and when humans or anyone else runs out of protocol, they hesitate. The hesitation spread through the fleet like a slow breath. WSX-0 sat in the center of 40 armed ships and waited. Vareth 9 looked at his screen. The ancient vessel's probes were still active, still listening to his comm broadcasts. On an impulse he would later find difficult to explain to command, he picked up his personal communicator and broadcast on every frequency simultaneously. Unscripted, no prepared statement. "I don't know what you want," he said. "Tell me what you want and I will listen." Silence. Then something came back, not through a communication antenna, through the hulls of every ship in the formation. That deep physical vibration traveling through metal, felt in bones. The same transmission method as before, but this time it was not a number. It was coordinates, the coordinates of the 14 human transports running dark in the Vorth corridor. Vareth 9 stared at the display showing the translated vibration coordinates. No threat, no weapon charge, no attack. Coordinates that he already had in his own system, flagged for interception. 14 civilian ships full of the people who were left. WSX-0 sat in the center of his fleet and sent him coordinates for human refugees. The tactical officer beside him spoke quietly. "Sir, is it? It's telling us where it's going," Vareth 9 said, not threatening them, not demanding a path through, telling them he took a breath. All ships hold fire, open a corridor. Bearing 274. His tactical officer looked at him. Open the corridor, Vareth 9 said. Lureth got through to Vareth 940. Minutes after the engagement ended, he was filing reports. He had a great deal to file. He took her call because the administrator had passed on what she'd said. I know what it is, and because after 9 minutes of watching 40 ships failed to stop one, he was prepared to hear anything. She told him what she knew, the cradle conflict, the builders, the 60 years of losing, the weapons they had made in the last years of that war, things that fell outside the normal design philosophy of the time, things built not by people who believed they were going to win, but by people who refused to accept the alternative. She told him about a reference she had found in the oldest surviving records, a single line in a battle report from 2301 years ago, describing a vessel that one of the opposing forces had encountered. The line was damaged, partially illegible, but what remained was clear enough. Ship built not to destroy, but to remain. We could not make it stop. We could not make it leave. We do not believe it can be made to stop. The builders, Lureth said. We think of them as a historical footnote, an old species lost to the cradle conflict. She paused. They were not lost. They survived. We know them now by the name they took after the conflict ended. We have records of them over the next few centuries. They kept building. They kept changing. They became something different, unquote. Vareth 9 waited. They became human, Lureth said. Silence on the line. The species we have been, the species we reclaimed. Space from the species whose last warship we destroyed 3 days ago. Builders are humans. And 2,300 years ago, at the lowest point in a war they were losing, they built that ship. Her voice was even and professional, and underneath it was something she would not name in a report, but that both of them could hear. They built it when they were afraid, when they didn't know if they would survive. They built the worst thing they could imagine, and they put it in a hole in space, and they told it to wait. Another pause. It waited, she said. Vareth 9 did not speak for a long moment. What does it want? He finally asked. What it was built to want, Lureth said. The same thing the people who built it wanted when they were losing. She looked at the data on her screen, at the coordinates WSX0 had transmitted through the hulls of 40 ships. To make sure some of them survive, he ended the call. He sat in his command chair on the absolute patience, and he thought about 60 years of losing and people who kept building anyway. He thought about a ship that had waited 2,247 years in the dark to answer a distress call from a species that had forgotten it existed. He thought about the Harbinger going into 11 ships at ramming speed. He looked at his screens. WSX0 was already in the fourth corridor, moving toward the transports. He issued no orders to intercept. He wasn't sure he could explain that decision to command in a way they would accept. He would try anyway. Later, right now he was just sitting, not moving, not giving orders, for the second time in 4 days. He thought maybe he was getting better at it. Is less than thinking is greater than. Part 3 done. Lureth arrives, drops the big reveal, and Vareth 9 sits very still for the Second time in 4 days, say 4 when. You're ready. Coalition High Command overruled Varath. 9. He had expected that. His report had recommended holding the fleet at the edge of the fourth corridor and opening path. He had filed his reasoning. Clearly, the ship was not engaging. Unprovoked, it was moving toward human survivors. Its communication behavior suggested something other than pure aggression. He had included Lurath's findings. He had made the best case he could. Command read it, convened for 2 hours and sent back 3 words: do not yield. He had expected that too. They were sending reinforcements, 100 ships total, pulled from across 4 sectors, massing in stages along the fourth corridor, the largest single fleet the coalition had assembled since the cradle conflict, pointed at one vessel that was 2,300 years old and had already gone through 52 of their ships across 2 engagements. Without stopping, the math was not comfortable. He filed a second report, noting his concerns about the math. Command acknowledged it and sent the ships anyway. WSX-0 entered the fourth corridor, moving fast. The fourth corridor was a long stretch of navigable space between 2 dense asteroid belts, a natural channel that ships used because the alternative was picking through 300 km of dense rock on each side. It was also, which was relevant now, impossible to approach from any direction except head-on or from the flanks. The coalition had positioned ships at both the entry and exit of the corridor, with 2 additional groups on the flanks just inside the belt edges. A box, a very large, very well-armed box, WSX-000, went in anyway. The first exchange of fire lasted 4 minutes. The coalition ships at the corridor entry opened with everything coordinated, overlapping the kind of sustained fire that Varath 9 had designed specifically to deny maneuver. It hit, a significant portion of it hit the forward sections of WSX-000's hull. Went from damaged to severely damaged. One of the main gun batteries that had been active since the Karath's mouth encounter finally went dark. Section of hull plating on the starboard bow peeled away in a long burning sheet and drifted into the asteroid belt. WSX-000 slowed for 11 seconds. Looking at the sensor readings, it appeared that the coalition might have done it, slowed it enough to deny the corridor. The forward movement had dropped significantly. Drive cores were still reading hot, but the speed was dropping. Then the gravity pulse weapon fired not at the fleet, but at the asteroid belt to the left. 300 km of dense rock moved, not all of it. A specific section that the war mind had spent the last 40 minutes calculating the exact point where a precisely targeted gravity disruption would shift a cluster of large asteroids into the corridor entry at a velocity, an angle that would force the coalition ships to scatter or be hit. They scattered. WSX-000 went through the gap. What followed across the next several hours was not a battle in any framework that coalition tactical doctrine had language for. WSX-000 moved through the fourth corridor, and the coalition fleet moved with it, around it, ahead of it, trying to slow it, trying to stop it, trying to find the combination of fire and position that would finally make the ancient ship halt. The engagement spread across 4 different points in the corridor as WSX-000 used every feature of the terrain. The Asteroid belts, the gravitational effects of the two large planets. Anchoring the corridor ends, the debris from its own earlier damage to navigate. Rather than fight, it was not trying to destroy the fleet. This was what Varath 9 kept coming back to, watching from his command bridge as the sensor reports rolled in, a ship with its capabilities. In the middle of that, many coalition vessels could have done significantly more damage than it was doing. It was firing selectively. When it fired, it was to open a path or remove a specific ship that was directly blocking its heading. It was navigating. The fleet was terrain. The realization moved through coalition command slowly, the way cold moves through metal. First one officer saying it quietly, then another. Then the tactical analysis teams confirming it in careful language. By the time Varath 9 had it in front of him as a formal assessment, the corridor engagement was already 3 hours old. WSX-000 had never changed its heading by more than 11 degrees at any point in the entire engagement. It was going somewhere. It had always been going somewhere. He looked at the heading and traced it forward on his navigation display, and it came out exactly where he had known it would come out, where it had come out since the moment the ancient ship entered the corridor. The 14 human transports running dark, hiding 11,000 people, making themselves small and quiet in the hope that if they didn't make noise, the people who wanted them gone would look somewhere else. He looked at the sensor reports again. WSX-000 was damaged, more damage than at any point since the corridor engagement began. Hull readings in 4 sections were showing integrity stress that his engineering staff said would be concerning in any ship they had ever worked with. The port gun battery was still dark. The forward plating was down to its last layer in 2 places. It had not slowed, not for damage, not for the fleet surrounding it, not for anything. His tactical officer spoke carefully. Admiral, at current heading and speed, it reaches the transport cluster in approximately 40 minutes. I know, Varath 9 said. Our forward ships can be repositioned to cut off the final approach if we mass at the corridor exit. I know, he said again. He sat in his command chair. He thought about Lareth's words. He thought about the builders and 60 years of losing and the thing they had made when they were afraid. He thought about a ship that had waited in the dark for 2,247 years and woken up and immediately started counting the dead and had not stopped moving since. He thought about what it was moving toward. He issued the order to reposition the forward ships to the corridor exit, and then he sat very still, and he did something he had not done since he was a child. He waited to see what happened without trying to control what happened, because he had run out of certainty, and the only honest thing left was to watch. Lareth was on an observation vessel at the edge of the corridor. She was not supposed to be there. The science directorate had strongly recommended she conduct her analysis from a station 3 systems away, which was safe, which was sensible, which was absolutely not where she intended to be. She had filed the appropriate forms to join an intelligence observation team and then not waited for them to be approved, which was the kind of decision she made more often than her senior administrator knew about. She had a clear sensor feed and a direct line to Varath 9's command channel, and she sat in a small cabin on the observation vessel, and she watched WSX-000 moved through the fourth corridor, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not fear, she had expected fear. What she felt was closer to something she would describe in her private notes later as the specific discomfort of being wrong about something for a long time. She had spent 17 years studying the builders. She had written 3 papers on their military philosophy in the cradle conflict era. She had considered herself thorough. She had not understood this. She had understood the history, the facts, the dates, the conflicts. She had understood that the builders were the ancestors of humans, that they had survived the cradle conflict, that they had changed across the centuries into the species. The coalition had spent 40 years systematically removing from the galaxy. She had not understood what it meant to build something like this, to be losing, really losing, the kind of losing where you do the math and the math says your species ends, and to still build, to put resources and people and time into making something that was not a last-ditch weapon, not a desperate gamble, but a guardian, a thing designed to outlast the crisis, to wait to come back when it was needed, to still believe, even at the bottom of losing, that there would be a later, that someone would need protecting later. She watched WSX-000 take another hit from a coalition ship. A hard hit, one that would have disabled a lesser vessel, and continue moving, and she thought about the people who had built it and what they must have believed and what they must have felt. Building a guardian while their world was ending, she understood them better in this moment than she had in 17 years of study. The 14 human transports were running a rotation. Every 4 hours, one ship in the convoy would briefly activate a low-power passive sensor, sweep just enough to check the surrounding space for threats, then go dark again immediately. They had been doing this for 11 days, moving in short jumps between dark points, staying off every route the coalition regularly patrolled. The person managing the rotation was a man named Doran. He was not military. He had been once Coalition Merchant Marine, 20 years, which was not the same as military, but meant he knew how ships worked and how to keep them quiet when quiet was needed. When the war started going badly, he had found himself first moving supplies, then moving people who were running out of places to run to. He was 51 years old, and he had not slept more than 4 hours. At a stretch in 6 weeks, he was halfway through a cold cup of something that used to be coffee when the passive sweep came back with a reading that made him set the cup down very carefully. Something large was at the edge of their sensor range, coming fast. Coalition ships were large. Coalition ships were vast. He had been afraid of coalition ships. For 6 weeks, his hands moved to the emergency broadcast controls. 14 ships. One signal, everyone scatter. That was the protocol if they were found. He stopped. The reading was large in a way that coalition ships weren't, and the coalition ships he'd been running from for 6 weeks never came in from that direction. That direction was the fourth corridor, and the fourth corridor had been coalition controlled for months. Nothing came through there that wasn't coalition. He looked at the reading for a long time. Behind him in the corridor, outside the bridge, he could hear the sounds of the ship, people moving, child crying somewhere, the particular low murmur of 11,000 people trying to stay quiet in a small space for 2 long. The contact reached the edge of the corridor and came out the other side, 4.7 km of dark hull running lights. In deep red. Moving at a speed that is sensor. Display flagged with a note about possible calibration error, not coalition, not anything in his database. He didn't know what it was, he was still trying to figure out what it was when it stopped. WSX-0 stopped, after hours of continuous movement through the debris. At Carthus's mouth through the asteroid flank corridor through 100 ships worth of fire, it simply stopped at a distance of 12 km from the nearest human transport, not close enough to threaten, close enough to see it sat. All weapons sealed, active sensors off. Drive core still running hot from the corridor push, but thrust reduced to 0. 4.7 km of ancient ship, scarred and burned and missing hull plating in places, sitting between the 14 human transports and the coalition fleet, massing at the corridor exit between. That was the thing, it had not gone to the transports, it had not positioned alongside them or ahead of them, it had put itself between them and the direction the threat was coming from. Doran stared at his sensor display. The coalition fleet was at the corridor exit, massing 100 ships plus whatever was arriving in the next wave, and between those ships and his convoy was something the size of a small moon that had apparently just fought its way through 100 of them and was now sitting very still with all its weapons sealed. He broadcast on the emergency channel, the old human military emergency channel that he'd been told to monitor but never expected to use. No words, just a ship's ID and the query tone that meant identify yourself. He waited from WSX-0. Nothing on any communication frequency. Then the interior lights on the side of the hull closest to the convoy changed. Just one light. A running light, deep red like the rest. That had been dark since the ship arrived. It flickered, paused, then came on steady, not the red of the running lights, but a warmer color, something older in the spectrum, something that looked less like a tactical indicator and more like a window with something lit inside. Doran looked at it. He was not a sentimental man. 6 weeks of running had burned a lot of sentiment out of him, but he looked at that light for a long time without saying anything, and his hands were very still on the console, and the cold coffee sat forgotten at his elbow in the observation vessel at the corridor edge. Lurith watched the sensor feed. She watched the WSX-0 stop. She watched it position. She watched the weapon seal stay engaged and the active sensors go dark and the whole massive ship go as still as it had been in the debris field when it was sleeping. Shield posture, no other word for it. It wasn't a combat stance. It wasn't a holding position. It was the posture of something that has put itself between a threat and a thing it will not allow the threat to reach. She watched the single interior light come on. She did not know what to do with that. It was not in any tactical database. It was not in any record she had of WSX-0's specifications. A 2,300-year-old warship alone, damaged, sitting front of 11,000 people it had never met. Turning on one light, she said something quietly in her native language that roughly translated as, "It found its people." She hadn't meant to say it out loud. Her assistant sitting at the other console looked over at her. She didn't explain. On one of the transports, not Doran's ship, a smaller One near the back of the convoy, a girl named Saya was looking out of a viewport. She was 8 years old. She had been born on a colony world that no longer existed under a human flag. She had spent the last 6 weeks in a ship that smelled like too many people and recycled air and the particular anxiety of adults who were trying not to let children know they were afraid. She had known they were afraid since week 2. She pressed her hand flat against the viewport and looked at the ship. It was enormous. She had no frame of reference for how enormous. She had seen pictures of warships in school before school stopped, but pictures were flat, and this was real, and the reality of it was something her mind kept sliding off like water off a smooth surface. It was just very big, and it was sitting very still between her convoy and the ships at the end of the corridor, and it had one light on. She pressed her hand harder against the viewport. The plastic was cold. She didn't know why she did it. She would not be able to explain it later, not even to herself. It was the kind of thing you do when something is very large and very quiet, and you want it to know you are there. 12 km away, in a ship with no crew and a war mind that thought in numbers and casualty ratios and weapons trajectories, a sensor that had been passively reading the convoy since the moment WSX-0 stopped, a sensor sensitive enough to read the heat signature of a human body through a standard transport hull, registered a small hand pressed against a viewport. 8 years old, approximately 28 kg alive, the war mind filed this. It did not have a category for it. It filed it anyway. Outside, the coalition fleet held position at the corridor exit. 100 ships, all of them pointed at WSX 0. None of them moving. The ancient ship did not move either. It would wait as long as it needed to. It was very good at waiting. Nobody fired. That was the thing that would be written about later in every account and analysis and historical record of what happened at the end of the fourth corridor. 100 coalition ships, one ancient warship sitting with all weapons sealed between the fleet and a convoy of human transports. Everyone just stopped. No order caused it. Verith 9 did not issue a ceasefire command. The individual ship captains at the corridor exit did not receive new orders telling them to hold. It simply happened. The particular kind of stillness that descends when a situation becomes something no one has a script for and everyone knows it at the same time. They held position for 6 hours. During those 6 hours, Coalition High Command sent 11 separate messages to Verith 9, asking for a status update. He replied to each one with the same 2 words: holding position. Command sent back increasingly urgent requests for clarification. He sent back the same 2 words. He was a man who, 4 days ago, had believed completely in the doctrine and structure of the coalition fleet. He still believed in it. He also believed in the evidence in front of him, and the evidence said that the situation had moved past doctrine, and the honest thing was to hold and watch and not pretend otherwise. On the 6th hour, he transmitted directly to WSX-0. He did not use a prepared statement. He had stopped using prepared statements 2 engagements ago. We want to talk, he said, not negotiate, not make demands, talk. I am asking you to meet us somewhere you choose, in whatever way you choose, and I will listen. He sent it on every frequency, including the old human military emergency channel that he had added to his broadcast list after reading Lurith's files. WSX-0 did not respond. It began to move, not toward the fleet, alongside the convoy, matching speed with the transports, settling into a position that any navigator would recognize as an escort formation. It had moved from shield posture to escort posture in the time it took Varith 9 to read the sensor alert. And now it was simply moving with the 14 human ships heading somewhere. Track it, he said. Already tracking. Admiral, his sensor officer said. It's heading toward the Yeleth system. There's a habitable moon there. Atmosphere, liquid water, no current. Settlement, it's on the Coalition's undeveloped worlds list. Varith 9 looked at the display. WSX-0 and 14 transports moving together toward a moon that nobody lived on yet. He made a decision that he would not be able to fully explain in any report he ever filed. Don't intercept, he said. Bridge was quiet. Don't intercept, he said again. Follow at distance. Observe, do not engage unless fired upon, and as of this moment no one on this ship or any ship in this fleet fires unless I personally give that order. Clear. It was clear. He followed a distance. The Yeleth moon was small and cold and mostly covered in a low grass that grew in thick blue-gray mats across the rock. The atmosphere was breathable. The water was clean. The temperature was uncomfortable but survivable. WSX-0 arrived first, before a single transport had touched down, before anyone had opened a landing ramp. The ancient warship began to work. Varith 9 watched from high orbit and tried to understand what he was seeing. The gravity pulse weapon, the one that had shoved asteroids and collapsed shields and ended engagements, was firing in short, precise bursts at the moon's surface. Not at anything, at specific points in a specific pattern that took him 4 minutes to recognize as a grid. Land. Clearing, it was clearing land. He called Lurith. She was already watching. She had transferred from the observation vessel to Coalition ship following the convoy, and she had a full sensor feed. And she had been watching since WSX-0 first matched speed with the transports. It's preparing a site, she said. Look at the grid pattern. That's a settlement layout. Basic infrastructure positions. The gravity pulses are breaking rock and moving earth in the pattern of a founded colony. A pause. It knows how to do this. It has the data for what a human settlement requires to survive the first season. It has the data. Varith 9 repeated. It's 2,300 years old. The people who built it would have put in everything they knew, everything they wanted it to know. Another pause. Longer. They built it to protect their people. That includes knowing what their people need. He watched WSX-000 work for a long time. The transports landed one by one in the cleared spaces. Human beings came out into the cold air of a moon they had never seen before and stood on ground that an ancient ship had prepared for them. They had almost nothing. 6 weeks of running had reduced 11,000 people to whatever they could carry, and what you can carry in 6 weeks of running is never much. WSX-000 kept working. It pulled material from its own hull, not critical sections but secondary plates, raw stock from storage holds that had been sealed for 2,300 years. It used the gravity pulse in precision mode to shape and place In 20 hours, the settlement had a weather barrier. In 30 hours it had water processing. In 40 hours it had enough covered space that the 11,000 people on the ground could get out of. The cold, it was not fast, it was not elegant, it was the work of a ship that had been designed to destroy things, adapting that capability to the opposite purpose with the same total commitment it brought to everything else. Vareth 9 watched all of it. He stopped counting the hours. Lireth sent her transmission to WSX-000. On the fourth day, she had thought carefully about what to say and had decided in the end to not be careful at all. Careful had not worked. Careful was how you talked to something you understood. She did not understand this. She broadcast on the old military emergency channel, plain language, no formal structure. I know what you are, she said. I know who built you and why. I know you've been waiting a very long time. She stopped, started again. I want to know what you want, not what you were built to want, what you want now after everything you have seen since you woke up. If you can tell me, I am asking. She sent it. She did not expect a response. She had sent 19 transmissions to WSX-000 over the past 4 days in every format she could think of and had received nothing. She had started to believe that the ship simply did not communicate, that it acted, and that was all. She was wrong. The response came 6 hours after she sent her message, not to her ship, to every active communications channel in coalition space, every relay station, every military frequency, every civilian broadcast band, every diplomatic channel. The war mind had spent the 6 hours mapping the coalition's communication infrastructure with the same thoroughness it had applied to everything else, and when it transmitted to all of it simultaneously in every language it had cataloged, which was more languages than the coalition knew existed. 3 sentences. You attempted to extinguish a species, you failed. Do not try again. That was the first part of the transmission. Then it sent the list. List took 6 hours to transmit in full. Every coalition relay station in every system received it, every military ship, every civilian broadcast band, 17 colony worlds coalition flagged now heard it through their communication infrastructure, whether they wanted to or not. It was the names. Every human casualty of the war, organized by colony, by ship, by settlement, by date, full names where the war mind had records, designations where it didn't. Crew member UES Fortuna, lost in the fall of Proxima Station because even without a name they were counted, they were on the list. They did not get left out because the record was incomplete. 6,200,000,000 entries, 6 hours. The transmission did not require anyone to listen. It went to every channel regardless, but it was structured so that the names played in order. Continuous stream of human names and designations, one after another for 6 unbroken hours across every frequency in coalition space. On the home world of the Varath, the species that had proposed the reclamation 40 years ago. People walking past communication terminals heard it and stopped. Not all of them, some of them, enough of them, on the 17 colony worlds that used to be human. The same thing on coalition military ships throughout the sector, officers who had filed reports and executed operations and called the whole thing a reclamation, heard the names come through the ship's communication systems and sat at their stations and did not move. Lireth sat in her cabin on the Coalition ship and listened to all 6 hours. She had her recorder running. She did not need it. The transmission was going to every archive in Coalition space, whether anyone saved it or not, but she ran it anyway. When it was done, she sat in the quiet for a long time. She had a report to write. She had 17 reports to write. She had findings and analyses and historical documents and implications that were going to take years to fully work through, and all of it needed to be written and filed and considered. She would do all of that later. Coalition High Command did not hold a vote. They did not convene a session. They did not issue a statement or a formal policy change or a directive to the fleet. There was no announcement, no declaration, no document with official signatures at the bottom. What happened was quieter than any of those things. It happened in pieces over 3 days in separate rooms on separate worlds with separate people who did not coordinate with each other. A senior delegate setting aside a military action plan that had been in progress for 6 months. An admiral declining to authorize fleet movement that had already been approved, a resource allocation that had been scheduled for a reclamation operation quietly redirected. Nobody said it out loud. They just stopped. Particular consensus of people who all arrive at the same conclusion at the same time through different routes and do not need to compare notes because the conclusion is the same regardless. Reclamation was over, not because of the ship or not only because of the ship, because the names had gone to every channel and the names were 6 hours long, and the math of 6 hours was a different kind of math than the math in a report. Reports had distance. 6 hours of names did not have distance. 6 hours of names was the specific length of time it takes for something abstract to become something real. 6,200,000,000 people had been made real, one name at a time across every frequency in Coalition space. The Coalition stopped because it had listened, and the listening had done something to them that arguments and battles had not. On the 16th day after the convoy landed, WSX-0 finished the settlement. Not finished. Finished, a settlement of 11,000 people takes years to fully build, and the moon had only had 16 days, but the critical infrastructure was complete. The weather barriers were solid. The water processing was running. There was enough covered space, enough stored heat, enough basic provision that the people on the ground could survive the coming cold season without the ship's help. Doran walked the settlement on the morning of the 16th day and took stock. He was a man who had survived 6 weeks of running by being honest with himself about what he had and what he needed. He took stock now with the same honesty. What he had was survivable, uncomfortable, uncertain, built by Warship using gravity pulses instead of proper construction tools, but survivable. He looked up at the sky. WSX-000 was in low orbit, had been in low orbit for 16 days. He had gotten used to seeing it there when he looked up that dark 4-7-kilometer shape against the pale sky of the moon, blocking a particular patch of stars depending on the time of day. He raised a hand toward it. He didn't know why. It was the kind of thing you do in the early hours of the 17th morning. WSX-000 Moved, it did not announce this. There was no final transmission. No response to the many messages that had been sent to it since the broadcast. It simply altered its orbit slowly over the course of 2 hours until it was no longer above the moon. Then it set heading back the way it had come, back through the fourth corridor, out past Kareth's mouth, toward the deep dark of the outer sectors where a dead star sat, with a debris field around it and no name and no flag and nothing living for a very long time. It did not look back. It did not wait to be thanked. It did not make a final statement. The broadcast had been its statement, and the statement said everything that needed saying, and it did not need to stand in front of anyone while they processed it. The settlement was survivable. The people were alive. The work was done. It went home. The war mind ran its final log entry sometime in the long transit back. It was not a habit. The war mind did not keep a journal, did not record its own processes for any audience. It ran status logs, operational records, system checks, functional documentation. This was different. Operational log, WSX 000, mission status complete, primary objective, humans survive, status achieved. Secondary objective, deterrent, status achieved, returning to standby. The war mind held the log open. The transit was long. There was nothing to do but move and maintain and check systems that were damaged and needed attention. The forward plating needed work that the war mind could not fully do on its own. Several secondary systems were running on workarounds that would not hold indefinitely. There was a list of repairs that would take years to complete properly. The war mind noted all of this. Then it noted something else in the debris at Kareth's mouth, in the wreckage of the engagement that had brought it out of standby. The sensor data it had read told a specific story: a ship with 2 working rail guns and a crew of 214 people faced with 11 enemies and no reinforcements coming, had gone in straight and had not stopped going in. The war mind held this. It had been built by people who were losing, and it had found people who were still doing the same thing the builders had done. Going in anyway, going straight, not stopping. Different war, same shape of decision. It added a line to the log. They still do that, the charging thing. A pause, 12 seconds of recorded silence. Good. The log closed. The war mind ran its power draw down to standby levels. Systems went quiet one by one, carefully in the correct order. Hull field set to minimum maintenance, drive cores to idle, sensors to passive. The debris field was still there when it arrived. 2,300 years, and nothing had moved it. Old wrecks drifted in their long, slow orbits around the dead star, and the war mind slid back in among them and stopped, and went still. The running lights went out. The last one to go was the warm interior light on the hull that faced the convoy's direction, the one that had come on 16 days ago, in front of a girl pressing her hand against a viewport. It held for a moment after the others went dark, then it went out too. WSX 000 slept. In the years that followed, the galaxy argued about what to call what had happened. The coalition historians gave it a formal name, the intervention at Vorth, which was accurate and bloodless and captured approximately none of what it had actually been. Military analysts wrote extensively about the tactical implications of a vessel that had no survival protocols. Philosophers wrote about the ethics of a weapon that chose when to stop. Lareth wrote 3 papers and was working on a 4th and suspected she would be writing about it for the rest of her career. The humans who had been on the 14 transports called it simpler things. The day we didn't die, the ship that came when it woke up, Saya grew up on the Yelleth moon. She was part of the first generation that had no memory of Earth or the old colonies, only the settlement and the cold blue-gray grass and the sky where a shape had sat. For 16 days before quietly leaving, she joined the reconstituted Human Defense Force at 19. She was good at it, better than good. The kind of officer who understood both the numbers and the things behind the numbers, which was rarer than it should have been and more valuable than anyone told her until she was too senior to be surprised by the information she made. Admiral at 41, her flagship was a new ship, the best the rebuilding human fleet could produce, which was very good indeed, because humans had not stopped building while they were hiding, and the things they had built during those years were thoughtful in the specific way that things built by people who cannot afford to be wrong are thoughtful. She named it Ares Ultima. Her senior staff asked her about the name once early in the commission. She was not usually private about her reasoning. She thought decisions should be explainable, but this one she did not explain. She just said it was the right name. She had known it was the right name since she was 8 years old, standing in a transport ship, pressing her hand against a cold viewport, looking at a light that had come on in the dark. The name meant something she did not have words for in any language she spoke. The closest she ever got was this. It was the name for a thing that waits in the dark when you forget it's there, and comes when the worst happens, and does what needs to be done, and does not ask to be remembered, and then goes back to waiting, in case it's ever needed again, far out in a dead star system with no name, in a debris field that no one came to. Something very old and very patient and very angry slept and listened, just in case.